The morning sun casts long shadows across the limestone blocks of Karnak Temple, where tourists now gather with cameras and guidebooks, marveling at columns that have stood for over 3 millennia. They see ancient grandeur, the work of master builders, a testament to human achievement. But beneath their feet, in chambers most visitors will never see, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of something so disturbing that it forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about ancient Egyptian religion. In the winter of 1923, British archaeologist Margaret Murray made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Deep in the temple archives of Mut at Luxor, hidden behind a deliberately constructed false wall, she found a clay jar that had remained sealed for over 2,000 years. Inside were 17 papyrus letters, written in the informal script of ordinary people, not the formal hieroglyphs reserved for monuments and official records. These were personal accounts, testimonies from women who had served in the temple for decades. Murray's initial excitement at the discovery quickly turned to horror as she began translating the contents. 3 senior Egyptologists, men who had devoted their lives to understanding ancient Egyptian culture, refused to work on the documents after reading preliminary translations. One wrote in his private diary that some truths were better left buried in the sands of time. The Egyptian authorities immediately classified the jar and its contents, sealing them away in a Cairo warehouse where they would remain untouched for 71 years. What could have been written in those letters that was so disturbing it caused respected scholars to abandon their work? What truth about ancient Egyptian temple life was considered too dangerous to reveal? The answer lies in understanding what really happened behind the sacred walls of Egypt's most revered temples during the height of the New Kingdom period, between 1550 and 1077 BC. This was Egypt's golden age, when pharaohs built monuments that still inspire awe today, when Egyptian influence stretched from Nubia to the Levant, when the gods seemed to smile upon the land of the Nile. But the temples of ancient Egypt were far more than places of worship. They were massive economic enterprises that controlled vast wealth and wielded enormous political power. The Temple of Amun at Karnak alone managed the labor of over 80,000 workers, owned more than 400,000 head of cattle, operated 83 ships, and controlled more land than the pharaoh himself possessed. These numbers come from actual administrative records that survive today. Meticulous accounts kept by ancient bureaucrats who documented every aspect of temple operations. The priests who ran these institutions were not simply holy men devoted to spiritual matters. They were shrewd businessmen who understood how to leverage religious authority for economic gain. They operated an elaborate system of loans and debts that ensnared countless Egyptian families, particularly during times of poor harvests or economic hardship. Here is how the system worked in practice. A farmer, desperate to feed his family during a lean year, would approach the temple for assistance. The priests would graciously provide grain for planting or copper for tools, speaking eloquently about the gods' generosity toward faithful servants. But this divine assistance came with interest rates that compounded relentlessly in the temple's favor. When harvest time arrived, the farmer often found that his crop was insufficient to repay the debt. The following year brought the same result, and by the 3rd year, the original loan had tripled through accumulated interest and fees. At this point, the priests would arrive at the farmer's door with a proposition. He could forfeit his land, enter debt slavery that would bind his entire family for generations, or he could offer something else as payment: his daughter. The priests used gentler language, of course. They spoke of divine service, of the girl being blessed beyond measure, of her living in the house of the god himself. The official term was Hemnetja, servant of the god, but the practical reality was unpaid labor for life. In the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, archaeologists have discovered actual contracts where fathers signed away their daughters. One document, dating to the reign of Rameses IX, records a farmer named Amenhotep transferring custody of his 9-year-old daughter Neferti to the house of Amun in exchange for forgiveness of a debt worth 15 daben of copper. 15 daben represented approximately 3 months of wages for a skilled craftsman. A child's entire future was traded for the equivalent of a season's work. But here is where the story becomes more complex and more disturbing. These girls were not condemned to lives of menial drudgery. Many were taught to read and write, skills that 90% of Egyptians would never acquire. Some rose to positions of considerable authority within the temple hierarchy, managing accounts, commanding hundreds of servants, wearing gold jewelry, and living in relative luxury. The most successful could even become God's wives of Amun, positions that carried genuine political power and influence. These women controlled vast resources, made important administrative decisions, and were treated with the respect accorded to high nobles. Some wielded more practical authority than many provincial governors. So why, if these temple positions offered education, power, and material comfort that most Egyptians could only dream of, do we find evidence of desperation carved into hidden corners of these same temples? Why did archaeologists discover child-sized handprints pressed into wet plaster in dead-end corridors, accompanied by crude hieratic script repeating the same phrase 17 times? Mut does not hear us. Mut was the mother goddess, protector of children, guardian of the innocent. These girls had been dedicated to her service, yet they carved messages suggesting she could not or would not hear their pleas. What were they trying to tell us across 3,000 years of silence? The answer lies in understanding what the priests called purification rituals, ceremonies that were considered essential preparation for divine service. In 1896, British archaeologist Flinders Petrie excavated a priest's tomb at Abydos and discovered a papyrus scroll containing detailed instructions for temple initiation rites. This document, now housed in the British Museum, reads like a technical manual, clinical and precise in its descriptions. The text outlines a process that began when a girl first entered the temple. She would be bathed in the sacred pool while her garments were removed in the presence of adult male priests. She would then undergo what the document calls examination for purity of body, a phrase whose meaning becomes clearer when we examine medical papyri from the same period. Her hair would be completely removed, and she would be required to recite an oath before the god Amun, declaring that her body belonged to the deity and that her will was subordinate to divine command. These were children, often as young as 8 or 9 years old, standing naked before groups of adult men and legally binding themselves to a life they could not possibly understand. Following initiation, these girls gained access to restricted areas of the temple that even nobles could not enter. They handled sacred objects, learned astronomy and mathematics, studied music and religious texts. One inscription from Karnak records a woman named Neferti as chief of the harem of Amun, responsible for administering temple accounts and commanding 300 servants. The contradiction is stark. These women possessed power, but no freedom. They could manage treasuries containing fortunes in gold and precious stones, yet they could not leave the temple grounds without permission. They could read complex mathematical and astronomical texts, yet they could not correspond with their families. They could command hundreds of servants, yet they could not refuse the demands of the priests who controlled their lives. In the 1960s, Danish archaeologist Lisa Manish was studying temple ostraca, broken pottery shards that ancient Egyptians used as notepaper for informal writing. Among the usual administrative notes and personal messages, she discovered dozens of medical prescriptions, all written for young women residing in temples. These prescriptions reveal a disturbing pattern of treatments for genital trauma, remedies designed to prevent unwanted pregnancies, and instructions for midwives attending girls as young as 11 through childbirth. One ostracon contains a prescription that reads like evidence of systematic abuse disguised as religious duty. It provides detailed instructions for treating injuries that could only result from forced sexual contact, using euphemistic language that refers to the god's visitation. The clinical precision of these medical texts suggests that such injuries were common enough to require standardized treatments. Among these medical prescriptions, Manisha found something even more heartbreaking. A letter written on broken pottery in handwriting that slopes as if the writer's hand was shaking. It is addressed to a sister serving in Mut's house, and the author expresses profound regret for having given the girl to the temple, admitting that he had believed the priest's promises that she would be blessed. The letter speaks of a mother who weeps every night and a father who cannot sleep, tormented by his decision. The letter is unsigned, and there is no record of a reply. Temple servants were forbidden from sending or receiving personal correspondence. But the story becomes even more complex when we examine evidence of genuine female power within the temple system. Hatshepsut, who became pharaoh and ruled Egypt for 20 years, began her career as a god's wife of Amun. Other women entered temple service voluntarily as adults, seeking the education and relative safety from forced marriage that temple life could provide. Some wielded genuine political influence and lived lives of considerable privilege and respect. What separated the powerful priestesses from the girls who carved desperate messages in hidden corridors? What determined whether temple service led to authority and respect or to suffering and desperation? The answer lies in one factor that the official records almost never mention directly: age. Margaret Murray's sealed jar contains 17 letters written by a woman named Tentipet, who served in the Temple of Mut for 40 years. Her accounts describe something the priest conducted every month, which she refers to as the monthly choosing. The official temple records, carved in stone and painted in gold, never explain what this ceremony entailed, but Tentipet documented it in letters that remained hidden for 3 millennia. What she described would challenge everything historians thought they knew about ancient Egyptian religious practices and reveal the true cost of building monuments to the gods. Murray's personal notes, archived at University College London, reveal the depth of her horror upon reading Tentipet's accounts. Her diary entry from March 12, 1923, describes finding the sealed jar during routine excavation work. What began as excitement at discovering intact papyrus documents quickly transformed into revulsion as she translated their contents. Tentipet wrote in demotic script, the informal cursive writing used for personal correspondence, rather than the formal hieroglyphs reserved for monuments. This was the handwriting of someone recording truth for herself, not creating propaganda for posterity. Her letters describe a systematic process that occurred with clockwork regularity, managed with the same bureaucratic precision that characterized all temple operations. In her 12th year of service, Tentipet was selected for what she calls the monthly rite. She had witnessed other girls being chosen before her, noting that they always returned changed, withdrawn, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. The ceremony took place in the inner sanctum after the evening offerings, when the temple was closed to ordinary worshippers and only the highest-ranking priests remained. 5 girls were chosen that particular month. The youngest was 8 years old. When she began crying from fear, an overseer struck her and declared that tears were evidence of spiritual impurity. The high priest wore the ceremonial mask of Amun, fashioned from gold with ram's horns extending from the sides. He explained that the god would speak through him, that the girls were blessed to receive divine attention, that their bodies were sacred vessels chosen for the god's pleasure. This was presented as the highest form of religious devotion. Murray's notes describe accounts of systematic abuse disguised as sacred ritual, organized with administrative efficiency, and recorded in temple logs alongside grain inventories and livestock counts. The evil genius of the system lay not in chaos or random cruelty, but in its methodical organization and religious justification. Temple records from Medinet Habu show rotation schedules listing girls by name, with marks indicating their service dates. Ages are recorded alongside these entries with clinical precision. The youngest girl documented in these administrative records was 7 years old. This was not an aberration or clerical error. This was policy, implemented with the same attention to detail that characterized every aspect of temple management. Tentapet was not the only woman who found that hidden jar and added her testimony. Over the decades, other temple servants discovered this secret repository and contributed their own accounts. One wrote of having her name changed upon entering temple service, explaining that her father had believed the priests when they said she would marry the god. She was 11 years old when she learned that gods do not marry their servants. Another letter describes 16 years of service, during which she bore 3 children to temple priests who claimed to be vessels for divine will. Each child was taken from her after 3 years of age. Her eldest daughter now served in the same capacity, walking in the morning processions but never acknowledging her mother's presence. The woman believed temple authorities had told the girl that her mother was dead. The handprints found in those dead-end corridors beneath the Temple of Mut gain new meaning in light of these testimonies. When girls first arrived at the temple for initiation, they were led through a narrow, dark passage as part of the ceremony. Priests told them to press their hands against the wet plaster on the walls, explaining that they were being reborn beyond this threshold, that their old selves died in this place. Confused and frightened children did as they were instructed, leaving permanent impressions of their small hands in the temple walls. Years later, when some of these same girls attempted to escape their circumstances, they would return to this corridor during night hours when guard patrols were minimal. They would press their hands against the same wall, but now their hands were larger, older, pressing with desperate force as they carved their message beside the handprints. Mut does not hear us. Not a prayer, but testimony. Evidence that they had existed, that what happened to them was real, that someone should remember their suffering even if the gods remain silent. The priests documented everything with meticulous care. They maintained detailed records of births, deaths, and services rendered with the same bureaucratic thoroughness they applied to managing grain stores and livestock inventories. One administrative text from Karnak reads like a business report, noting that 5 new servants of Amun had received divine blessing in the inner sanctuary, and that the god was pleased with their service. 5 new servants, ages unspecified, divine blessing, clinical language that transformed children into inventory items and abuse into religious ceremony. The priests wrote these records not from guilt or shame, but from genuine belief that they were fulfilling sacred duties. They saw themselves as faithful servants, facilitating divine will, not as perpetrators of systematic abuse. This religious justification made the system particularly insidious. The priests could maintain clear consciences while inflicting terrible suffering, because they had convinced themselves and their society that they were performing holy work. The girls themselves were taught that resistance to priestly demands was resistance to the gods themselves, that their suffering was divinely ordained, that their silence was a sacred duty. By the late New Kingdom period, around 1100 BC, something began to change. The position of God's wife of Amun underwent dramatic transformation, becoming exclusively reserved for royal women, daughters of pharaohs who possessed genuine political power and protection. These women were required to remain celibate throughout their lives, with no marriages, no children, and no divine unions with temple priests. The Papyrus Harris, one of the longest papyrus documents ever discovered, records reforms instituted by Rameses III around 1150 BC. Using carefully diplomatic language, he describes abuses that had corrupted the sacred houses and impurities that had stained the divine order. He does not elaborate on specifics, but he completely restructures temple administration, changing who could hold power and who had access to vulnerable temple servants. Egyptologist Gay Robbins argues that these reforms represented a direct response to growing evidence of systematic abuse that had reached even the pharaoh's court. The solution was to place women from royal families in positions of authority, women with political connections, bodyguards, and the power to refuse priestly demands. The victims had become the solution. By 700 BC, the god's wife of Amun essentially controlled Thebes, commanding armies, managing vast treasuries, and wielding power that rivaled the pharaohs in Upper Egypt. She remained unmarried and untouchable, holding genuine authority born from centuries of documented abuse. But these reforms primarily protected women at the highest levels of the hierarchy. For lower-ranking temple servants, the system continued largely unchanged. The transformation created a two-tiered structure where elite women gained unprecedented power while ordinary girls remained vulnerable to exploitation. One of the most significant reformers was a woman who had lived through the system herself. Shepenwepet II served as god's wife of Amun from 700 to 650 BC, having been dedicated to the temple at age 9. After 68 years in temple service, she used her authority to issue a decree that remains carved into the walls at Karnak today. Her reforms established minimum age requirements for temple service, limited priestly authority over female servants, guaranteed family visiting rights, and ensured that women's voices would be heard in disputes. She had remembered her own childhood experiences and used her power to change the system that had shaped her life. After 600 BC, the archaeological record shows a curious phenomenon. Personal accounts from temple servants become increasingly rare. Hidden letters disappear. Carved messages stop appearing in forgotten corridors. Pottery shard confessions become almost non-existent. Had the abuse finally ended? Or had record-keeping become more centralized and controlled? Had women stopped writing their truths? Or had someone ensured those truths would never be found again? The silence itself raises disturbing questions about what might have been deliberately erased from history. Margaret Murray's sealed jar remained classified by Egyptian authorities for 71 years. When the contents were finally released in 1994, most Egyptologists chose to ignore the documents entirely. The testimonies were too uncomfortable, too complicated, too challenging to existing scholarly narratives about ancient Egyptian civilization. It became easier to write papers about temple architecture and religious symbolism than to confront evidence of systematic abuse disguised as sacred ritual. Easier to marvel at the engineering achievements than to acknowledge the human cost of those monuments. The academic community, like the priests 3,000 years earlier, found ways to maintain comfortable myths by ignoring inconvenient truths. Venient truths. Today, visitors can walk through the same corridors where these girls once lived and died. They can touch the same limestone blocks, breathe the same air, stand in the same chambers, where systematic abuse was disguised as divine service. The tour guides speak of religious devotion and architectural marvels. They rarely mention the voices that were silenced in those sacred spaces. The pattern extends beyond Egypt's borders. Throughout history, institutions have claimed divine authority to justify the unjustifiable. They have used beautiful words to hide ugly truths, sacred language to mask secular cruelty. The temples of ancient Egypt were not unique in their capacity for evil disguised as good. They were simply more thorough in their documentation. Modern archaeologists continue to uncover evidence that challenges sanitized versions of ancient Egyptian temple life. In 2007, excavations at Dendera revealed a cache of medical instruments specifically designed for gynecological procedures on young patients. The tools were found alongside papyrus fragments describing treatments for what translators diplomatically termed ritual preparation injuries. Chemical analysis of residue on these instruments revealed traces of substances used to prevent pregnancy and treat internal trauma. The discovery raised immediate questions about the scope and duration of abusive practices in Egyptian temples. If such specialized medical equipment was necessary, if standardized treatments existed for ritual injuries, if chemical contraceptives were routinely administered, then the abuse was not occasional or isolated. It was systematic, expected, and medically managed. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the British archaeologist who led the Dendera excavation, found herself facing the same institutional resistance that Margaret Murray had encountered nearly a century earlier. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities requested that her findings be presented with sensitivity to Egypt's cultural heritage. Academic journals questioned the interpretation of her evidence. Colleagues suggested alternative explanations for the medical instruments and chemical residues. The pattern of denial and deflection remained unchanged. Uncomfortable truths about revered institutions continue to face institutional resistance, even when the evidence is overwhelming and the victims have been dead for millennia. But some scholars refused to remain silent. Dr. Joanne Fletcher of the University of York began compiling a comprehensive database of temple abuse evidence from multiple sites across Egypt. Her research identified common elements that appeared repeatedly in different locations and time periods. Standardized initiation rituals, age-based selection criteria, medical treatments for specific types of trauma, administrative records that documented human suffering with bureaucratic precision. Fletcher's work revealed that the abuses documented in Murray's letters were not isolated to individual temples or specific time periods. They represented systematic practices that operated across Egypt's religious infrastructure for centuries. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of temples, thousands of victims, generations of silence. The database also revealed patterns of resistance and reform. Some women who survived the system used their eventual positions of power to protect others. They established age restrictions, created oversight mechanisms, and documented abuses in ways that would be difficult for future generations to ignore or deny. Their efforts saved countless lives, even though their names are largely forgotten by history. Tentipet's hidden letters contained one particularly haunting detail that Murray had initially overlooked in her horror at reading the accounts of systematic abuse. Near the end of her correspondence, Tentipet mentioned 3 other women who had discovered the secret jar and added their own testimonies. She provided an index of all 20 letters that the jar was designed to contain, but Murray had found only 17. 3 letters were missing. In 2003, an antiquities dealer in Cairo claimed to have located the missing correspondence. He said the letters had been in a private collection since the 1920s, acquired by a European collector who had connections to the original excavation team. The dealer arranged a meeting with Egyptian authorities to discuss repatriation of the documents. He died of a heart attack 3 days before the scheduled meeting. The dealer's shop was cleared out within hours of his death. His inventory was dispersed to unknown buyers. His records were destroyed in what authorities described as a routine disposal of estate materials. The 3 missing letters vanished once again, along with any hope of recovering their contents. According to Tentipet's index, which Murray had translated before the Egyptian authorities confiscated the original jar, those 3 letters contained something that made them even more dangerous than the testimonies of abuse. They contained names, specific identities of priests who had participated in the systematic exploitation, families who had known what was happening and remained silent to protect their own interests, officials who had been paid to ignore evidence of abuse. They contained a network of complicity that extended far beyond the temple walls. Somewhere in Egypt, hidden in a private collection or buried beneath shifting sand, those names wait in darkness. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate the death of an antiquities dealer, and the destruction of his records does not want those identities revealed. Even after 3,000 years, even after the collapse of the civilization that created the system, someone still has a reason to fear what those letters might expose. The implications extend beyond academic curiosity about ancient Egyptian religious practices. If the missing letters identify specific families or institutional networks that enabled systematic abuse, then some of those same family lines or institutional structures might still exist in modern Egypt. Ancient power structures have remarkable persistence across centuries and civilizations. The effort to suppress the missing letters suggests that the truth they contain remains dangerous to contemporary interests. Someone with significant resources and connections has determined that these particular voices from the past must never be heard. The conspiracy of silence that protected the temple system 3,000 years ago continues to operate in the 21st century. Meanwhile, the physical evidence keeps accumulating. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at multiple temple sites have revealed hidden chambers and sealed passages that were deliberately blocked with rubble and concrete in ancient times. These spaces appear to have been hastily sealed, often with valuable objects still inside, suggesting that someone was desperate to hide evidence of what had occurred in those rooms. Chemical analysis of soil samples from these sealed chambers reveals traces of organic compounds consistent with human decomposition. DNA analysis of bone fragments found in temple foundations shows evidence of young females who died from trauma consistent with physical and sexual violence. Isotope analysis of teeth from these remains indicates that many victims came from distant regions of Egypt, supporting evidence that the debt system was used to acquire girls from impoverished families across the empire. The scientific evidence corroborates every detail described in the testimonies that Murray discovered. The systematic nature of the abuse, the young age of victims, the geographic scope of the recruitment system, the medical management of trauma, the administrative documentation of human suffering. Yet mainstream Egyptology continues to minimize or ignore these findings. Museum exhibitions focus on pharaonic glory and architectural achievements. University courses emphasize religious symbolism and cultural accomplishments. Popular documentaries celebrate the engineering marvels while glossing over the human cost of construction. The same pattern of institutional denial that protected the temple system in ancient times now protects the reputation of ancient Egyptian civilization in modern academic and cultural discourse. Beautiful words continue to hide ugly truths. Sacred narratives continue to mask secular suffering. Dr. Fletcher's database now contains evidence from over 40 temple sites across Egypt. The pattern is consistent everywhere. Young girls acquired through debt systems, systematic abuse disguised as religious ritual, medical documentation of trauma, administrative records treating human beings as inventory, attempts to hide or destroy evidence when reforms threatened the system. The database also documents the reformers who fought against the system from within, women who used their eventual positions of power to establish protections for others, men who risked their careers and lives to document abuses, families who refused to surrender their daughters despite economic pressures. Their resistance saved lives and preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost. Some of the most powerful testimony comes from unexpected sources. Graffiti carved into remote temple walls by maintenance workers and low-level priests who witnessed what happened in restricted areas. Personal letters between family members discussing the true cost of temple service medical papyri, describing treatments for conditions that only made sense in the context of systematic abuse. These voices from the margins of Egyptian society tell a different story than the official monuments and royal proclamations. They describe a civilization where religious authority was used to justify exploitation on an industrial scale, where bureaucratic efficiency was applied to human suffering, where divine language disguised very human cruelty. The evidence challenges fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian civilization. The temples were not just centers of religious devotion. They were economic enterprises that used spiritual authority to extract wealth and labor from vulnerable populations. The priests were not just holy men serving the gods. They were businessmen who understood how to leverage religious belief for personal and institutional gain. The gods themselves become more complex figures when viewed through the lens of this evidence. Were Amun and Mut divine beings who demanded human sacrifice and sexual service? Or were they convenient masks worn by very human predators who found that religious authority provided perfect cover for criminal behavior? The answer probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Ancient Egyptians genuinely believed in their gods and found real spiritual meaning in their religious practices. But they also lived in a society where religious institutions had become corrupted by unchecked power and economic incentives. The same temples that provided genuine spiritual guidance to some also provided systematic exploitation to others. The tragedy is not that ancient Egyptians were uniquely evil or that their civilization was fundamentally corrupt. The tragedy is that they created systems so normal, so accepted, so thoroughly integrated into their society that participants could document horrific abuses while believing they were performing sacred duties. 3,000 years later, those same patterns persist in different forms. Institutions still claim divine or moral authority to justify harmful actions. Beautiful language still disguises ugly realities. Victims still find their voices silenced by those who benefit from existing power structures. The missing letters from Tentepet's jar represent more than historical curiosities. They symbolize all the voices that have been silenced, all the evidence that has been destroyed, all the truths that someone has determined are too dangerous to reveal. They remind us that the conspiracy of silence which protected Egypt's temple system was not unique to ancient times or distant places. It operates today in institutions we revere, using methods we recognize, justified by language that sounds noble and pure. The names in those missing letters might be 3,000 years old, but the systems they represent remain frighteningly contemporary. The systematic destruction of evidence extends far beyond ancient Egypt's borders. In 1997, construction workers renovating a medieval monastery in southern France discovered a sealed chamber containing dozens of children's skeletons, alongside religious artifacts and administrative records. The French government immediately classified the site, restricting access to approved researchers who were required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Similar discoveries at religious sites across Europe have followed identical patterns of official secrecy and academic silence. This suggests that the Egyptian temple system was not an isolated aberration, but part of a broader historical pattern where religious institutions use spiritual authority to facilitate systematic abuse. The methods varied across cultures and centuries, but the fundamental structure remained consistent. Vulnerable populations were acquired through economic pressure, abuse was disguised as religious duty, and evidence was systematically destroyed or suppressed when exposure threatened institutional power. Modern forensic techniques have revealed disturbing parallels between ancient and contemporary cases of institutional abuse. The same psychological manipulation tactics documented in Egyptian temple records appear in survivor testimonies from religious institutions worldwide. Victims describe identical patterns of isolation from families, gradual normalization of abuse through religious justification, and systematic silencing of those who attempted to speak out. Dr. Rachel Stevens, a forensic psychologist who has studied institutional abuse cases spanning 3 millennia, identifies what she calls the sacred authority syndrome. Perpetrators consistently use religious or moral language to reframe exploitation as spiritual service, transforming victims into willing participants who believe they are fulfilling divine purposes. This psychological manipulation proves remarkably effective across different cultures and time periods. The Egyptian priests, who told terrified children they were blessed to receive divine attention, were using identical tactics to those employed by modern predators who claim to be instruments of God's will. The language changes, but the underlying manipulation remains constant. Victims are taught that resistance equals spiritual failure, that silence equals devotion, that their suffering serves a higher purpose. Stevens's research reveals that institutional abuse systems share 5 key characteristics, regardless of historical period or cultural context. First, they acquire victims through economic vulnerability or family desperation. Second, they use religious or moral authority to justify exploitation. Third, they isolate victims from outside support systems. Fourth, they normalize abuse through gradual escalation disguised as spiritual progress. Fifth, they systematically destroy evidence and silence witnesses when exposure threatens the institution. The Egyptian temple system exhibited every one of these characteristics with remarkable precision. Farmers surrendered daughters to resolve debts. Priests used divine authority to justify systematic rape. Girls were isolated from families and forbidden outside contact. Abuse was presented as sacred ritual that became progressively more severe. Evidence was hidden in sealed jars and buried in forgotten chambers. 3,000 years later, investigative journalists documenting contemporary institutional abuse cases encounter identical patterns of evidence, destruction, and witness intimidation. Sources disappear unexpectedly. Documents vanish from archives. Survivors receive threats that convince them to recant testimonies. The methods have evolved with technology, but the essential strategy remains unchanged. The persistence of these patterns across millennia suggests that institutional abuse represents something more fundamental than individual criminal behavior. It reveals how power structures naturally evolve to protect themselves through systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Religious, educational, and charitable institutions become vehicles for predation precisely because they attract individuals seeking help and guidance. The stones of Karnak still stand today, their carved prayers reaching toward heaven. Their hidden chambers holding secrets that span 3 millennia. Tourists walk these corridors. Guides speak of divine glory, and the cycle continues. Beautiful words masking ugly truths. Sacred narratives protecting secular suffering. Those 3 missing letters from Tentipet's jar remain hidden somewhere in the darkness, carrying names that someone still fears to reveal. The handprints of desperate children pressed into temple walls remind us that voices silenced by power never truly disappear. They wait in the shadows of history, demanding to be heard, refusing to let us forget that the greatest monuments are often built upon the smallest graves.